The man with the rusted trailer and the 9-year-old girl was already being laughed at before he finished signing his name. It wasn't loud laughter. That almost would have been easier. It was the other kind, the kind that lives in the corner of a mouth, in the slow turn of a head toward a teammate, in the way a group of men who know each other well don't need to say anything out loud to say everything. Daniel Holt heard it the way you hear weather coming before it arrives. He kept his eyes on the registration form. He pressed the pen down a little harder than necessary and finished writing his name. The morning was cool and gray, the kind of April Saturday that can't decide whether it wants to be winter or spring. The Millbrook Regional Circuit sat on the edge of farmland about 40 minutes outside the city, a modest track by any standard, a quarter-mile oval with a small grandstand on the front stretch and a pit lane that smelled of exhaust and cut grass and something fried coming from the concession trailer near the entrance gate. For the teams that came here every season, it was home. For the teams that came here with sponsors on their haulers and matching shirts and equipment that cost more than Daniel's truck, it was practice. A warm-up, something to do before the circuits that actually mattered. Daniel Holt did not have matching shirts. He had a gray thermal undershirt, a flannel jacket with a fraying left cuff, and a 9-year-old daughter named Rosie sitting on top of a red metal toolbox he'd set on a furniture dolly because the pit lane was long and the toolbox was heavy, and she had asked twice already if she could ride it. He had said yes both times. She sat up straight with her hands on her knees like a child trying to look older than she was, which she always did in new places, which he had always loved about her without ever finding the words to say so. Behind his pickup, on a single-axle trailer with one replaced fender that didn't quite match the rest, sat the car. It was a 1994 Chevrolet Lumina, white, with a blue number 47 stenciled on both doors in the kind of clean, careful brushwork that takes time. The body had been straightened but not showboated. There were places where the metal still held the memory of old damage, smoothed down but present, the way scars are present. The engine bay was a different story, though no one at the registration tent was close enough to see that yet. From a distance, from across the pit lane where the sponsored teams were unloading their cars off hydraulic trailer decks with the casual efficiency of people who do this every other weekend, the Lumina looked like exactly what they assumed it was. A backyard project from a man who had watched too many racing videos and convinced himself that enthusiasm was the same thing as preparation. It was not the worst assumption. It was just wrong. Marcus Vail ran the Millbrook Regional Circuit the way certain men run things they built themselves, with genuine pride, real competence, and a narrowness of vision that he would have called standards. He was 51, square-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years ago and had since become merely authoritative. He had raced semi-professionally through his 30s, had 2 regional titles on a banner above the timing booth, and had spent the last decade building this circuit into something he considered legitimate. He took that word seriously. Legitimate. It meant something to him that was difficult to explain and very easy to feel in the way he spoke to people he hadn't decided about yet. He was standing behind the registration table when Daniel arrived, not because he needed to be, his volunteer coordinator handled registrations, but because it was opening morning and he liked to see who was coming. He liked to take the measure of a room. He was good at it, mostly. He was wrong about Daniel within approximately 4 seconds of seeing the trailer, and he would not know that for another 2 days. He leaned on the table with both forearms and watched Daniel approach with Rosie on the toolbox dolly, and something in his expression settled into a particular configuration. Not unkind exactly, but closed. Decided. The look of a man who has already filed you somewhere and is just waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. "You're Holt?" he said. "That's right," Daniel said. "First time at Millbrook?" "First time at Millbrook." Marcus glanced at the trailer, at the Lumina, at the unmatched fender. His eyes came back to Daniel with the carefully neutral expression of a man being diplomatic. "You run regionals before? Street stock class, I mean. Competitive events." "Once or twice," Daniel said. He was not being coy. It was simply the most accurate answer, and Daniel Holt had a lifelong preference for accuracy over impression management. Once or twice was true. What was also true, what Marcus had no way of knowing and Daniel had no particular interest in announcing, was the nature of those once or twice. But that was a different conversation, and this was not the moment for it. Someone near the equipment trailers laughed. It was short and quiet and almost certainly not meant to carry as far as it did, but the morning was still and cool, and it carried a man in a red sponsored jacket, one of the semi-pro weekend regulars, a driver named Cobb who had 3 top 5 finishes last season and wore that fact in his posture. Said something to the man beside him that Daniel didn't catch. He didn't need to catch it. The shape of it was enough. Rosie heard it. He knew she heard it because her chin came up slightly and her hands tightened on her knees, and she had her mother's way of going very still when she was deciding whether something mattered enough to be upset about. She was looking at Daniel's face, not at Cobb, not at Marcus, at her father's face, reading it the way she had been reading it since she was old enough to understand that his face was usually the truest weather report available. Daniel's face said nothing. He signed the form. He took his entry packet. He thanked the volunteer coordinator by name because he'd seen her name tag, which was a thing he always did and which always surprised people, and then he turned the dolly around and wheeled Rosie back toward the trailer. "She's 9, Marcus called after him. Not unfriendly. Conversational. 9 in June, Daniel said without turning around. "She's my crew chief." A beat of silence. Then a small sound from somewhere in the group of assembled men. Not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff, something in between, and the morning moved on. Rosie waited until they were back at the trailer, out of earshot, before she spoke. She didn't ask what crew chief meant, because she already knew. He had explained it to her 6 months ago in the garage on a Tuesday night when she couldn't sleep and had come downstairs to find him under the car, and she had lain on the cold concrete beside him on her back, and he had pointed at things and named them and told her what they did, and she had listened with the particular focused attention she gave to things she had decided to take seriously. "That man didn't believe you," she said. "No," Daniel agreed, lifting the wheel chock from the trailer deck. "The one by the red truck laughed." "I know." Rosie was quiet for a moment. She turned her cardboard sign over in her hands. Purple marker, "Go, Dad." Letters slightly uneven because she'd done it herself the night before without asking for help spelling anything, which he had pretended not to notice but had noticed completely. "Is the car good enough?" she asked. Daniel set the wheel chock down. He straightened up. He looked at the lumina, at the careful stenciling of the number, at the bodywork that still held the memory of its past, at the hood beneath which 18 months of evenings and weekends and late-night decisions lived in the form of systems and solutions that no one at this circuit had thought to ask about yet. "Yeah," he said. "It's good enough." Rosie nodded once, the way she did when she had asked a serious question and received a serious answer and found it satisfactory. She set her sign down on the toolbox. She picked up the tire pressure gauge and held it out to him. "Which one first?" she asked. He took the gauge from her hand. "Front left," he said. "Always start front left." She walked to the front left tire and stood beside it, waiting the way she always did. Around them the pit lane continued its morning noise. Generators starting, metal on metal, voices carrying across the cool air. The sponsor teams moved with the efficiency of belonging. Daniel Holt moved with something quieter and harder to name. He knelt beside the front left tire, pressed the gauge to the valve, and read the number. It was exactly where he needed it to be. It had been exactly where he needed it to be since Thursday. Daniel Holt had never been the kind of man who needed a room to know he was there. He had spent the better part of his adult life in the middle of things, middle of the org chart, middle of the salary band, middle of the kind of career that looks perfectly reasonable from the outside and feels, from the inside, like standing on a platform watching trains go to places you never quite boarded. He was good at his work. Genuinely good in the way that doesn't photograph well, the kind of good that lives in the details nobody checks until something goes wrong, and then everybody's glad someone was paying attention. He had spent 11 years as an automotive systems engineer at Carver Regional Manufacturing, and in 11 years he had been passed over for senior positions 4 times, thanked in 3 company-wide emails without his name being spelled correctly, and described by his division manager in a performance review as quietly reliable, which is the corporate language for a man they are not worried about losing. He had not been angry about any of it. That was the thing people sometimes found difficult to understand about Daniel, the absence of visible bitterness in a life that had given him reasonable cause for some. He simply did not organize his sense of self around what institutions thought of him. He had Elena for that. Elena, who had seen him clearly from the first month they were together and had never once revised her assessment downward. Elena, who used to say that the difference between Daniel and ambitious men was that Daniel already knew what he was worth and had therefore never needed to prove it to a room. She had been right. She had been right about most things. She died on a Wednesday in October, 3 years ago, 6 weeks after the diagnosis, which had not given anyone enough time to prepare and had not been intended to. Rosie was 6. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of going still when she was thinking hard and her mother's way of asking questions that were actually statements wearing a question mark for politeness. Daniel had taken one look at her the morning after the funeral, sitting at the kitchen table in her school clothes even though there was no school, eating cereal with the focused solemnity of a child who had decided that normal things needed to keep happening, and understood that the rest of his life had just finished being about anything other than her. He had taken unpaid leave from Carver. The leave became permanent without a formal conversation. Calls unreturned, emails answered briefly, a mutual drifting that suited everyone. He did not miss the work. He missed the problem-solving, which was a different thing, and which he eventually found again in the garage on the evenings Rosie slept. The Lumina had been Elena's car. She had bought it used when she was 26, before she knew Daniel, and had driven it for 9 years with the particular attachment some people form with vehicles that have carried them through large portions of their lives. When it finally stopped being road reliable, she had refused to sell it. It stays, she had said, with a simplicity that ended the conversation. It had sat in the back of the garage under a canvas cover for 4 years, through 2 house moves and everything else, and Daniel had not been able to look at it directly for the first 18 months after she was gone. Then one night, Rosie asleep, house quiet, the specific 2 a.m. insomnia that grief manufactures, he had pulled the cover off, just to look, just to have something to do with his hands and his eyes that wasn't the ceiling. He had stood there for a long time. Then he had gotten his diagnostic kit. The racing project did not announce itself as a racing project. It began as mechanical attention systems checks, fault tracing, the satisfaction of understanding what something needed and providing it. It became an engine rebuild, which became a suspension overhaul, which became a conversation with a retired track mechanic named Lou Ferris who lived 3 streets over and had forgotten more about circle track setups than most people at Millbrook had ever learned. Lou had come over to look and had not left for 4 hours, and somewhere in the second hour he had said, quietly, that with the right work this car could do something real. Daniel had nodded without making any promises. He had made the promises anyway, just not out loud. Rosie had found out about the race not because he told her but because she was 9 and lived in the same house and was constitutionally incapable of not noticing things. She had stood at the garage door one evening in November, watching him work, and asked if the car was going somewhere. He had told her the truth. She had been quiet for a moment and then asked if she could come. He had said yes before he finished thinking about it, which was how he made most of his best decisions. She had not asked whether he thought he could win. She had asked whether the car would be scared. He had thought about that question more than she knew. Marcus Vail had built the Millbrook Regional Circuit with his own hands and someone else's money and the kind of focused will that, in different circumstances, might have been called vision. The money had come from a silent partner, a local businessman with a fondness for motorsport and a preference for tax structures that benefited from recreational land development, and the partnership had dissolved cleanly after 3 years, leaving Marcus with full ownership of the circuit, a modest operating debt, and the freedom to run things the way he believed things should be run. He had taken all 3 without complaint. The debt he had managed. The freedom he had used carefully and completely. He had raced semi-professionally through most of his 30s regional circuits, a handful of state-level events, 1 near qualification for a national series that he did not discuss directly but that lived in the timing of his pauses when racing was mentioned by people who hadn't done it. He was good. He had been genuinely, technically good, with a mechanical intuition that his early crew chiefs had trusted and a racecraft that was clean and aggressive in the right proportions. What he had not had was the particular kind of luck that separates good regional drivers from the ones who get the calls. He had understood this eventually and accepted it without theater, which was one of the things he actually respected about himself. He had not pretended. He had pivoted. He had built something instead. The circuit was real. It mattered to the people who competed on it, and Marcus knew that, and it was one of the things he had done that he considered genuinely good. He had built infrastructure where there had been farmland. He had created a legitimate competitive ladder for regional drivers who had no other pathway. He had run the technical inspections with a rigor that earned him enemies and a reputation simultaneously, and he had decided the reputation was worth more than the friendships. What he had also done, more slowly, more invisibly, in the way that character flaws accumulate rather than arrive, was begin to mistake his authority over the circuit for authority over the sport itself. His word on who belonged here had become, in his own mind, indistinguishable from objective truth. He had stopped noticing when his assessments were based on evidence and when they were based on the particular blindness of a man who has been the smartest person in a room for long enough that he has forgotten how to check. He had looked at Daniel Holt's trailer on Saturday morning and made a file. Backyard hobbyist. Sentimental project. Here for the experience, not the result. Possible liability in traffic. Worth monitoring on track but not worth serious attention. He had filed it cleanly and moved on, which was efficient and wrong, and he would not discover how wrong for another 36 hours. His own daughter's name was Claire. She was 24 and lived in Portland and called on birthdays with the careful punctuality of someone meeting an obligation. He did not blame her for the distance, or rather, he told himself he did not blame her, which was not quite the same thing. He had been, by any honest accounting, a father who was present in the physical sense and frequently absent in the sense that children actually require. He had attended events. He had provided. He had operated with the assumption that competent provision was the primary language of love, and he had been wrong about that for long enough that by the time he understood it the conversation had already moved on without him. He thought about Claire sometimes when he watched the Paddock families, the kids running between trailers, the fathers lifting children onto wool arches to see over the pit wall. He watched these scenes with an expression that people who didn't know him well might have read as vague approval. People who knew him better would have recognized it as something he didn't have a word for. He had seen Rosie Holt at the fence during Friday's test session, not during the session proper, but in the 15 minutes beforehand when Daniel was doing final checks and the pit lane was quiet. She had been holding her cardboard sign with both hands, standing perfectly still at the chain link, watching her father move around the car with the focused attention of a person observing something they consider important. Marcus had noticed her the way you notice peripheral things when your mind is elsewhere, registered, logged, moved past. He had not noticed what she was holding. He had not noticed the way she watched her father's hands. He had not noticed, specifically, the way Daniel spoke to her when she handed him something, the complete and unhurried attention he gave her in those moments, as if whatever she was saying was the most relevant information currently available to him. Marcus was watching the car. He was always watching the car. He had long since trained himself to see machinery before people, which served him well in technical inspections and less well in most other contexts. On Saturday afternoon, a local amateur livestream crew set up near the front stretch, 2 kids in their early 20s with a camera, a lapel microphone, and an audience of approximately 400 subscribers who followed regional racing with the devotion that used to be reserved for local newspapers. They interviewed Marcus for 12 minutes between sessions. He was comfortable on camera in the way that men are comfortable on camera when they have been the authority in a room for a long time. He spoke in full sentences, he used technical vocabulary without over-explaining. He was neither warm nor cold but something measured and credible in between. Toward the end of the interview, he was asked about the field this year. He paused in the way he always paused before saying something he had already decided to say diplomatically. "It's a strong field," he said. "We have some very serious competitors this year, drivers who've put in genuine preparation time, and I think the racing is going to reflect that. What I will say, and I say this every year, is that regional racing is a sport. It requires preparation, technical knowledge, actual racecraft. We welcome everyone who comes here in that spirit." He stopped there. The interviewer, who was 22 and understood subtext better than Marcus gave him credit for, asked whether that meant some entrants perhaps didn't come in that spirit. Marcus gave a careful half-smile. "I think some people are drawn to the story of racing more than the discipline of it," he said. "That's human nature. There's nothing wrong with it. But a race is a race." The camera, by chance or instinct, caught Daniel in the background at that moment. Crouched beside the Lumina's rear quarter, adjusting something small and specific, Rosie standing beside him with the tire gauge held ready in both hands, watching his face. The live stream had 400 subscribers. The clip, extracted and posted to a regional racing forum by someone who had been watching carefully, had 14,000 views by Sunday morning. The comments were not about Marcus. They were, almost entirely, about the man in the background and the girl with the gauge and the thing that was quietly visible in the 18 inches of air between them. The specific, unremarkable, irreplaceable language of a father and a daughter who had learned to work alongside each other in the particular silence of people who do not need to explain themselves to one another. Marcus didn't see the comments until Sunday evening. By then, the race was already over. The practice session was scheduled for 90 minutes on Saturday afternoon, and Daniel used it the way he used most things, carefully, without advertisement, with a specific purpose that was not immediately visible from the outside. He ran 3 laps at what appeared to be a conservative pace. His times were not remarkable. They would not have drawn attention in either direction on any timing sheet at any regional circuit in the state. This was intentional. Daniel had learned a long time ago, in a context that had nothing to do with motorsport, that the most valuable diagnostic information comes from a system running at manageable load. Push too hard before you understand the variables and you learn about failure rather than performance. He wanted to know how the track behaved at this temperature, how the car setup translated from Lou Ferris's garage floor to actual asphalt, where the grip was and where it wasn't, and whether his instinct about the entry to turn 3 was correct. His instinct about the entry to turn 3 was correct. He made 2 adjustments after the first 3 laps. A minor rear brake bias change that took him 40 seconds and a tire pressure drop on the right front that took him 20. He made them without ceremony, without consulting anyone, without the performance of visible deliberation that some drivers use to signal their seriousness to the pit lane audience. He simply knew what he had observed and what it required, and he provided it, the way he had always worked. The next 3 laps were different. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but different in the specific measurable way that matters. The way the car rotated through the center of the corners had changed, and the exit speed on the backstraight had changed with it, and anyone with a lap timer and sufficient attention to detail would have noticed that Daniel Holt's quiet, unsponsored, 30-year-old Lumina was running lines that the track had not seen yet this weekend. A driver named Garrett Solis noticed. Solis was 28, third-generation racing family, sponsored by a regional auto parts chain with enough budget to keep his car properly prepared year-round. He was not, by his own admission, an instinctive talent. He was a craftsman, technically educated, precise, the kind of driver who wins through preparation and consistency rather than brilliance. This meant he understood preparation and consistency when he saw it in someone else, and he was constitutionally unable to dismiss things he understood. He had clocked Daniel's first 3 laps without particular interest. He had clocked the next 3 laps with increasing attention. He had put his timer down after the 6th lap, looked at the numbers for a moment, and then looked across the pit lane at the Lumina. He walked over after the session with his hands in his jacket pockets. He stood beside the car's rear quarter for a moment without speaking, looking at the suspension geometry in the way a musician might look at an unfamiliar instrument, cataloging it, respecting it, finding the places where decisions had been made. Then he looked at the engine bay. He was quiet for longer than was casual. "What cam are you running?" he asked finally, without looking up. "Custom grind," Daniel said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Lou Ferris spec." Solis looked up then. "Lou Ferris is still alive?" 73. Still sharp. Solis looked back at the engine bay. He nodded slowly once, with the particular nod of a man updating a file he thought was already closed. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't offer anything that could be called a compliment, because compliments would have been beside the point, and both of them knew it. He straightened up, put his hands back in his pockets, and walked back to his own pit space. He didn't talk about the Lumina to his crew after that. But his crew chief noticed later that Garrett had pulled up the full entry list on his phone and spent several minutes looking at Daniel Holt's registration details, and had then spent several more minutes looking at nothing in particular with the focused expression of someone doing arithmetic. Rosie had held her sign at the fence for the entire 90-minute session. Every lap. She had not sat down. She had not looked at her phone because she did not have a phone, and would not for another 2 years at minimum, a position Daniel held with quiet firmness on grounds he considered self-evident. She had watched the car come around the track with the same focused attention she gave to things she had decided were serious, and between laps she had watched the other cars with the particular analytical gaze of a child who has been told what to look for and has chosen to actually look. After the session, when Daniel came back to the pit space and she handed him the pressure gauge in the order he had taught her. "Front left first, always," she said without preamble. "Your car goes through the corners differently." "Yes," Daniel said. "Lower," she said. "More flat." He looked at her. "That's exactly right," he said. She received this with a small nod and handed him the notebook where she had been writing down the things she observed, in her careful, slightly too large handwriting, with the occasional spelling error that he would not correct tonight. He read it on the way home. 3 pages. Every observation technically accurate. One margin note at the bottom of the last page that read, "The red car brakes too early, I think." She was right about that too. The fitting had been on his mind since February. It was a fuel line connector, a small, standardized AN fitting at the junction between the primary fuel line and the carburetor inlet. He had inspected it in February during a full systems review, had rated it as serviceable but borderline, had noted it in his maintenance log with a flag that read "Monitor, consider replacement pre-race." He had monitored it. He had checked it 4 more times across March and April. It had not deteriorated further in any measurable way. The seal was intact. The metal showed no progression of the surface fatigue he had originally flagged. On 4 separate inspections he had made the same judgment call, within tolerance. Proceed with monitoring. He had been right 4 times. He was wrong on the 5th. He found it at 11:40 p.m. on Saturday night, the night before race day, during what was supposed to be a brief final systems walkthrough before he closed the trailer and got some sleep. He had done the walkthrough from habit more than necessity. The car was ready, the setup was confirmed, the numbers from the afternoon practice were good. He was tired in the clean, earned way that comes from a day of physical work done well, and some part of him was already at the morning. The staging area, the grid, the 30 seconds before the green flag when everything goes quiet in his chest and he finds the particular stillness he can't explain to people who haven't felt it. He pressed the fuel system to operating pressure. He watched the fitting. The seep was small. Barely a seep. A darkening of the metal at the joint. The faint smell of fuel that should not have been present. The preliminary language of a failure that had not yet fully committed. He watched it for a full 30 seconds to be certain he was seeing what he was seeing. He sat back on his heels. He looked at the fitting for a long time. The thing about a fuel line failure, a real one under race conditions, under sustained heat and vibration, is that it does not give you a second conversation. It happens in a specific direction and does not reverse. He had spent 18 months building a car that was safe. Not impressive, not fast, not anything worth discussing before it had earned discussion, but safe, first, above everything. That had been a non-negotiable that preceded all the other decisions. He had promised Rosie, not in words but in the way that counts more than words, that the car was safe. He had promised himself. The fitting had to come out. The replacement had to go in. The race started at 9. It was 11:40 p.m. He went through the inventory twice methodically without rushing. He knew before the first pass that he didn't have the replacement. He had the right fitting in 2 other sizes, which was almost worse because it confirmed he had been organized about everything except this specific item, which he had flagged and monitored and ultimately trusted past the point where trust was the right tool. He closed the inventory case. He sat on the trailer step. The parts suppliers nearest to Millbrook, the regional auto parts chain, closed at 9. The 24-hour national chain 20 minutes up the highway stocked common and fittings but not in the specific thread specification. He knew this because he had checked their inventory online in February when he was deciding between sourcing options, which meant he had been thinking about this moment in February and had still not fully resolved it, and sitting with that was its own specific flavor of difficulty. There was one other option. There had always been one other option. He had simply been hoping he wouldn't need it. His brother's name was Paul. Paul Holt, 41, who ran a salvage and parts operation called Holt Motor Recovery from a property 40 minutes northwest that contained, across 3 acres of organized chaos, approximately 40,000 individual components in various states of viability, cataloged in a system that existed primarily in Paul's memory and was more reliable than it had any right to be. Daniel and Paul had not spoken in 14 months. Not from hostility or not primarily from hostility, which is a distinction that matters. They had spoken less after Elena died, which was true of Daniel and most people, and then they had had a specific conversation 18 months ago about money that had gone badly, and the aftermath of that conversation had settled into the particular silence that family members maintain when they have decided to wait for the other person to cross a distance that both of them consider the other person's responsibility to cross. Daniel had been certain he was right about the money. He was still certain, in the careful, evidenced way he was certain about most things. Being right had not made the silence shorter. It had made it feel more permanent, which had been an education in the difference between correctness and resolution. He picked up his phone. He looked at Paul's name in the contacts for a moment. Still there, never deleted, the way you keep things you're not done with even when you don't know what being done would look like. He pressed call. It rang twice. He was composing a voicemail, finding the most efficient structure for a message he did not want to leave, when Paul answered. "Hey," Paul said. "Hey," Daniel said. A beat. The particular silence of two people locating each other across a distance that is not geographical. "I need a part," Daniel said. "AN fitting, -6, straight, 37-degree flare. Race day tomorrow, 9 a.m. start. I can't find a supplier." Paul was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to help, but the silence of someone running inventory. This was a distinction Daniel knew how to read. "Come up," Paul said. "I've got 3 of them in the back of a '98 Firebird I pulled last month." "I'll pay whatever you want," Daniel said. "Shut up," Paul said, not unkindly, and ended the call. Daniel knocked on the truck window softly. Rosie was supposed to be asleep in the cab. He had settled her there an hour ago with her blanket and the small stuffed dog she had named Gerald and still slept with without apology. He had been wrong about the asleep part. She was sitting up, Gerald in her lap, watching the trailer with the patient, wakeful expression of a child who had decided she was not going to sleep until she knew what was happening. He opened the door. He crouched so they were at eye level. "I have to go get a part," he said. "Is the car okay?" "It will be." She looked at him. She had her mother's way of looking at him, the direct, undeflectable attention of someone who would rather have the true thing than the comfortable approximation of it. "Is it serious?" she asked. He considered the honest answer. "It would have been," he said, "if I hadn't caught it." She processed this. "But you caught it." "I caught it." She nodded slowly once. "Okay," she said. She lay back down. She pulled the blanket up. Then, just before he closed the door, she said, "Tell Uncle Paul hi." He stood still for a moment. "You knew I was calling Paul?" She looked at him from under the blanket. "There wasn't anyone else," she said simply, with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a 9-year-old who has been paying attention to her father's life with more diligence than he realized. He closed the door carefully. He stood in the dark of the pit lane for a moment, beside the trailer, beside the car. Then he got in the truck and drove north through the dark toward his brother's salvage yard. And the night was clear and the road was empty, and he had exactly the right amount of time if he didn't waste any of it. Paul arrived at 1:15 in the morning with the fitting, a thermos of black coffee, and the particular economy of a man who has decided that the present moment is more important than the 14 months preceding it. They worked in near silence. Paul held the light while Daniel worked the old fitting out and seated the new one with the careful torque of a person who understands that the correct value matters and that the socket set knows the difference. When it was done, Daniel pressurized the system and they both watched the junction for 60 seconds without speaking. Nothing moved. Nothing seeped. The metal was clean and still and honest. Paul poured coffee from the thermos into the cap and held it out. Daniel took it. "She sleeping?" Paul asked, nodding at the truck. "Supposedly," Daniel said. Paul almost smiled. He looked at the car. He walked around it slowly, the way he walked around things he was evaluating. Not the quick assessment of someone forming a first impression, but the slower circuit of someone who already knows what they're looking at and is confirming it. He crouched at the rear and looked at the suspension. He stood and looked at the engine bay. "Lou Ferris?" he said. "Lou Ferris." Paul nodded. He handed the thermos back. "You're going to do something tomorrow," he said. It was not a question. "Maybe," Daniel said. Paul looked at him in the way that brothers look at each other when they have known each other for 40 years and have no remaining interest in the performance of modesty. "Don't maybe me," he said. Daniel drank the coffee. It was very good coffee, which surprised him, and he said so, And Paul said he'd started grinding his own beans in December, and they stood in the pit lane in the quiet dark and drank coffee and did not discuss the 14 months or the money or the specific conversation that had ended things, because some of what is broken between people can be addressed later, and some of it can be addressed by simply showing up at 1:15 in the morning with the right fitting and a thermos. By 3 a.m. the car was sealed, checked, and ready. Paul left without ceremony. Daniel was asleep beside Rosie in the truck cab by 3:10. He woke at 7. Rosie was already sitting up, Gerald tucked under her arm, watching the morning with the alert composure of a child who had been awake for a while and had chosen patience over noise. She had her sign in her lap. She had redone one of the letters that had smudged overnight, in the same purple marker with considerable care. The morning had become spring, clean and cool and bright, the kind of morning that feels like a statement. The circuit was already loud with preparation, engines cycling, the percussion of the pit lane reassembling itself after the night. Daniel made oatmeal on the camp stove he kept behind the seat, and they ate it from 2 cups leaning against the trailer, watching the circuit wake up, not talking much because neither of them needed to. He qualified 7th from 12. This was exactly what he had intended. Qualifying positions at Millbrook are determined by single hot laps run in reverse championship order, which meant Daniel ran 4th to last and posted a time that placed him mid-grid, respectable, unremarkable, insufficiently interesting to draw attention or telegraph anything about what the car was actually capable of in race trim versus single-lap qualifying mode. This was a distinction that mattered enormously and that exactly one person in the paddock understood Daniel had made deliberately. Garrett Solis, who had qualified 2nd, watched Daniel's qualifying lap with a focused attention that his crew attributed to professional diligence and which was, in fact, something closer to fascination. Cobb, who had laughed by the trailers on Saturday morning, qualified 1st. He acknowledged this with the relaxed confidence of a man who considers the result a formality. The race was 20 laps. Daniel ran the first 4 in 7th, which was where he had started, and which alarmed no one. He moved to 6th on lap 5 by outbraking Cobb's teammate into turn 1. Cleanly, without drama, the kind of pass that is obvious in retrospect and invisible in prospect. He moved to 5th on lap 7 the same way. By lap 9 he was 4th, and the timing booth had his name on the split screen for the first time, and Marcus Vail looked at the number beside it and then looked back at his lap chart and did a calculation he had not expected to be doing. By lap 12 Daniel was 3rd. He was not pushing. This was the specific thing that Solis, running 2nd, understood and found extraordinary. The Lumina was not being driven at its limit. It was being driven at the limit of what was required to be exactly where it needed to be, which is a different and considerably more sophisticated thing. On lap 14 Marcus left the timing booth and walked to the pit wall. He stood there and watched. On lap 16 Daniel passed Solis for 2nd. He did it on the outside of turn 3, the entry Daniel had diagnosed in the very first practice lap, in a line so geometrically precise that Solis, when asked about it afterward, would say it was the cleanest pass he had been on the wrong side of in 6 years of regional racing. Solis did not try to defend it, not because he was conceding but because there was nothing to defend against. By the time he understood what was happening, the Lumina was already through. The leader was Cobb. The gap was 1.4 seconds. Lap 17. Daniel ran the gap down to 0.6 seconds in one lap, which should not have been possible in a 30-year-old Lumina and Cobb felt it before he saw it. Felt the car behind him changing the nature of the air, changing the terms of what he had understood the race to be. He had been managing his lead. He had been comfortable. He was no longer comfortable. Turn 3, lap 17. Daniel went inside. It was not a desperate move. It was not aggressive. It was timed with the particular patience of someone who has been watching the same corner for 2 days and knows exactly where the door opens and for how long. Cobb defended late. It didn't matter. The door was already open, had been open for precisely 0.8 seconds, and Daniel was already through it. The crowd went quiet. Then it went loud. At the fence, Rosie did not cheer. She pressed her sign. Go, Dad, purple letters, one slightly smudged and carefully redone, against the chain link, and she closed her eyes. Daniel crossed the line first on lap 20. Clean. Unhurried. Exactly as planned, in the way that the best plans are invisible until they are complete. When Rosie opened her eyes, he was already slowing for the cool-down lap, one hand out the window, not waving exactly, just open palm to the sky, a gesture that meant nothing and everything, a gesture that was for one person and no one else. She put her hand up too. The noise came back to the circuit the way noise always comes back after something unexpected. In a rush, all at once, as if sound itself had needed a moment to understand what had just happened. The announcer found his words. The timing booth crew found theirs. Cobb sat in his car on the cool-down lap for longer than the cool-down lap required, which was the only comment he made for the rest of the afternoon. Marcus Vale stood at the pit wall for a moment after the finish. He did not immediately return to the timing booth. He stood with his forearms on the wall and watched the Lumina complete its cool-down lap, watched the way it moved, the way it had always moved, which was the same way it had moved in practice and qualifying and every lap of the race, and which he was only now understanding he had been looking at without seeing. He was a man who prided himself on objectivity. The objectivity was real. The blindness had been real too, and the fact of the blindness was more uncomfortable than the loss of any particular assumption, because it raised the question of what else he had been looking at without seeing, and that was a question with a long answer he was not ready to begin. He went back to the timing booth. He ran the splits one more time from the beginning. He sat with them. Daniel found Rosie where he had known he would find her. At the trailer, standing in her socks on the asphalt because she had taken her shoes off at some point and forgotten to put them back on, which happened in circumstances where she was focused on something more important than her feet. She had her sign in both hands. She had Gerald tucked under her left arm. She was watching the track entrance for the car, and when it came around the corner of the pit lane she stood up slightly on her toes and then came back down and was very still. He climbed out of the car. He was not theatrical about it. He unclipped the window net, removed the Hans device, got out the way he had gotten in carefully with attention to the car, not performing anything for anyone watching. His legs were good. The car had been smooth. He felt the way he felt after a job done correctly, which was clean and quiet and slightly hollow in the specific way that the end of something long prepared always feels. Rosie walked to him. She did not run. She walked with her sign and her dog and her bare feet on the warm asphalt, and she stopped in front of him and looked up at him with her mother's eyes and her own particular expression, which was not triumph and not excitement but something more considered, something that had thought in it. "Was the car scared?" she asked. He had been waiting for this question since the morning. He had been thinking about it, in the margins of lap counts and setup calculations and fuel pressure readings, since the first time she had asked it on Friday evening with the matter-of-fact curiosity of a child who believed the question was reasonable, which it was. He crouched so they were at eye level. He thought about it genuinely, not as a figure of speech, not as a thing to say to a 9-year-old, but as an actual question deserving an actual answer. "No," he said. "I don't think so." "How do you know?" "Because it did exactly what it knew how to do," he said. "Things that know what they're built for aren't scared. They're just ready." Rosie considered this for a moment with the slow, architectural consideration she gave to ideas that were going into long-term storage. Then she nodded once and handed him Gerald, which was her highest expression of trust and which she only extended to people and moments she considered worthy of it. He held the stuffed dog with both hands. He looked at it. He looked at her. Something moved through his chest that didn't have a clean name in any language he had available. "Nice driving," she said seriously. He laughed. He hadn't expected to laugh, and it came out whole and real, and she smiled at it. The particular smile of a child who has made a parent laugh unexpectedly, which is one of the most satisfying smiles available to a 9-year-old. Marcus found them 20 minutes later, when the post-race formalities were winding down and the pit lane had begun the slow dispersal of a day completing itself. He walked to the trailer directly, not as a man building up to something but as a man who had already done the building and was now simply arriving. Daniel was loading equipment. Rosie was sitting on the toolbox, shoes back on, writing something in her notebook with concentrated focus. "Holt," Marcus said. Daniel looked up. He waited. Marcus stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, the posture of a man who is not accustomed to the particular configuration this conversation required, which was not authority and not apology exactly but something in the narrow space between them. He looked at the car. He looked at Daniel. "I made some assumptions," he said. "At registration." "People do," Daniel said. Not dismissively, just as an observation. "They weren't fair assumptions." Daniel set down the equipment case he had been lifting. He straightened up. He looked at Marcus with the direct, unguarded attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. Not the attention of a man preparing to win an argument, but the attention of a man listening. "I built this car to come here and race," Daniel said. "That's what I did." He paused. "That's enough." Marcus nodded slowly. He started to say something else, and then he looked at Rosie, who had stopped writing in her notebook and was watching the two men with the quiet, careful attention of a child, who understands that adult conversations sometimes contain information that is important to understand. Marcus looked at her for a moment in the way he had not looked at her before, which was the way you look at someone when you are finally actually looking. "She yours?" he said, which he already knew, and they both knew he already knew, but it was a different kind of question than it seemed. "She's mine," Daniel said. Marcus looked at the sign, propped against the trailer wheel. "Go Dad." Purple letters. One slightly smudged and carefully redone. He looked away. He cleared his throat. He said, without quite meeting Daniel's eye, "You know what you can do with that car. You should come back in June. The summer series." Then he put his hands back in his pockets and walked away across the pit lane, and Daniel watched him go, and didn't say anything and didn't need to. They packed up slowly, the way they always packed up. Everything in its right place, no rushing, Rosie handing things and Daniel stowing them with the unhurried ritual of people who have learned to enjoy the work that comes after the work. The pit lane emptied around them. The afternoon light went long and golden across the track surface. Somewhere near the concession trailer someone was playing a radio quietly. The trophy was a modest thing, regional circuit standard, a small silver-colored cup on a base with the class and date. Daniel set it in the back of the truck without ceremony, next to the empty cooler and the spare wheel and the folded tarpaulin. Rosie looked at it once and then looked away out the window at the circuit going quiet around them. They drove home through the long gold of the late afternoon, the truck and the trailer and the lumina behind them and the radio on low, and Rosie fell asleep somewhere on the county road with her head against the window and Gerald in the crook of her elbow, and Daniel drove in the particular silence of a man who has arrived somewhere he was not certain he would reach. Somewhere on the highway he reached up and adjusted the sun visor. His hand found the photograph in the natural way that hands find things they have reached for many times. Elena, young, leaning against the lumina in a parking lot somewhere sunny. Her head turned slightly toward the camera, not quite smiling, the expression of a person on the edge of saying something. He looked at it for one moment. The road was straight and the light was good and Rosie was asleep, and he allowed himself the one moment fully, without management or economy. The way he had been learning, slowly and imperfectly, to allow the moments that deserved to be felt. Then he put his eyes back on the road. The photograph stayed where it had always been. The lumina followed them home through the dark, steady on the trailer, carrying nothing that wasn't already there.